Can everyone hear me? All right. Okay. Bonjour, ECC Paris. Je suis ravie d'être ici pour en parler de crypto and gouvernance. My name is Hilary Kivitz. I'm not going to do this talk in French. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk about DAOs and hostile takeovers and walk through some ideas for how we might shore up governance on DAOs to counteract hostile takeovers. So as we all know, DAOs have emerged as a new form of collective governance where communities set the rules and those are encoded on the blockchain. So unlike corporations that are managed by a board of directors, DAOs manage themselves. The participants not only own the assets, but they also own the day-to-day decisions and the overall management. But just like corporations, DAOs can be subject to malevolent actors, where those actors actually take advantage of the architecture of the DAO to profit at the expense of the DAO. So we all know that Wall Street has a long history of raiders and activists and other short-term opportunists. And Carl Icahn is probably the most infamous of those, and that's him. And back in 2018, he said that cryptocurrencies were ridiculous, that he wouldn't touch it. But more recently, he said that he was going to get into Bitcoin in a big way. I don't know what that means for DAOs, but the problem is that we are going through a period right now where there are very low token values combined with pretty low governance participation. And that is the perfect breeding ground for hostile activity. So let's take a look at this chart. It came from DAO, and it's a few days old, so the numbers might be outdated for the recent surge in pricing, but it serves our purpose still. So currently, if you look today, I think it's about 9.4 billion that are locked in treasury on DAOs. And if you look at the distribution, most of those DAOs have less than $1 million in their treasury. But there's still a significant number that are over 10 million and more that are over 100 million. So those are values that start to catch people's attention. Now let's turn over to, now let's move over to governance engagement. So here you see that there are 3.8 million governance token holders outstanding, but only about 685,000 active voters and proposal makers. So that's just about 18% engagement, not very high. Then you move over to how many holders are on each of those DAOs, and you see that most of them have fewer than 100 holders. So that's good news because that means that most of them are pretty closely held in a small group of people. But then there's about 16% that are greater than 1,000 holders, and about 5% that should say greater than 10,000 holders. So 5% have more than 10,000 holders, and those are the ones that we should probably focus on because there's going to be more movement in the hostile arena in that area. Now let's look at the specific numbers relating to the top DAOs. So this is organized by the top DAOs by treasury value. And this, again, is DAO. So Uniswap has about 2.9 billion locked on the treasury. But according to CoinMarketCap, and that measures the float, so not the maximum issuance of the tokens, there's about $5.1 billion of market cap on the token. So that is pretty fine because they've got 2.9 billion of treasury and far more of market cap. So it would be difficult to, to take over a network like that. But move down to BitDAO, and there you see that they have 1.1 billion in their treasury, And they've got about 288 million of market cap on their tokens. So that's a much smaller number. Gnosis has about 880 million on their treasury and about 376 million of market cap on their token. And Polkadot's got 303 million, 7.2 billion on their treasury. So they're in a pretty good position. So let's focus on BitDAO and Gnosis then, just for now. You can see the makeup of their tokens in the middle column, but then move over to the right, and you see that for BitDAO, there are about 19,500 governance token holders, but only 47 are active members. And then go down to Gnosis, and there are 18,000 governance token holders, and only 1.6 thousand are active members. So that's less than 1%. So what can exploiters do in crypto in a situation like this? Well, they can, and this has all been well trod. I mean, I think Vitalik wrote an article specifically on this back in 2017. But attackers can engage in self-dealing and conflicts of interest. For instance, they can fork a network. And that actually happened in 2018. I think most people know about Justin Sun and Tron trying to take over Steemit. That was forking of a network where he didn't have a community on Tron, but he had the technology, and Steemit had a strong community, and he was able to negotiate a block trade of Steemit tokens in a private sale, and then collate those with tokens held by centralized exchanges with whom he had a relationship. So the facts are a little unclear as to what those exchanges knew when they agreed to collate the tokens, but at the end of the day, what it meant was that he was able to get more than 50% of the vote and execute on his plan. The second thing that people can do where there's a conflict of interest in self-dealing is that they can raid treasuries and take the locked assets. So recently, earlier this year in February, Build actually was raided in just that way. They had actually a really small market cap. They had about $200,000 of tokens circulating, but their treasury was 500,000. And you wouldn't normally think that that was something, that would catch the attention of a hostile raider, but somebody did end up being able to get enough to control a vote on the governance contract to authorize unilateral minting of the tokens, and was able to exploit that to drain the liquidity pools and the treasury. The next thing is empty voting, and that really is decoupling of the financial interest in the tokens from the vote. So that can happen in a number of different ways, but something that's pretty common is that you'll see before some key governance votes on some of the platforms, high borrowing activity on some of the decentralized platforms, and you can track that on Morpho. You can look at it on Etherscan and see that it happens on Morpho or Compound or any of those lending platforms. The mechanics is that the exploiter would borrow the token, execute on the vote, then repay the token, the loan on the token, and really be long only the fees to borrow it. The other way is that you can hedge away your financial interest in the token. That happens on Wall Street all the time, where you can enter into a hedge transaction where you really have no long exposure on the underlying token, but you still have the vote. And in those instances, somebody might want to do it because they want to, they own controlling shares or significant portions in a competitor project. And so they want to create havoc on that competitor to augment their own project. So there's conflicts of interest that come into play, and there's various ways to exploit around those. And then the last is vote buying and green mail. However, rarely is it obvious who the bad actors are. And I think in a free market, it's fair to say that it's not always clear who's malicious and what the right outcome should be. So on the one hand, you could say that these are just expensive bug bounties. On the other hand, that's probably not conducive to welcoming a diverse and broad set of of capital into the ecosystem, it makes people feel a little unsafe when you could get burned in these type of ways. So the other type of situation are cases where it's really not clear whether reasonable minds would think that one outcome was better than the other, or who the good actor is and who the bad actor. So for instance, back in February, Ondo tried to propose a reorganization for a sushi swap, which, as we know, is one of the most decentralized exchanges. And they were doing it for their own strategic reasons, and the details are probably longer than we can get into here, but I think if you go read the Discord and the forums, I'll let you decide for yourself where you think that the right outcome should have been in that case. So in a world where it's not clear who's in the right, what can we do? We can rely on process rather than outcome. So that means that we can have disclosure plus some protective provisions, and that should lead to better decisions. And I think one of the keystones in the TradFi world is that good governance should balance deterring purely exploitative behavior while not creating undue friction or entrenching poor management and underperforming teams. So most DAO frameworks already have governance protections such as these. So they've got quorum requirements or high vote thresholds. They have time-phased voting, cool-down and lock periods, and they have community guardians who can act in the case of an emergency. And sometimes they have extra protections for certain fundamental decisions. But I want to ask, should we go a little further and start building into Web3 governance, some of the protective concepts that we find in traditional finance? So in that toolkit, we'll find an array of tools, including disclosure requirements, controlling shareholder obligations, fairness standards, burden shifting, poison pills, and voting cutbacks. And I want to take a walk through each of these to see what it might look like to adopt them in the Web3 context. So in terms of disclosure, some ideas would be to try to build platforms that integrate off-chain data to provide composite information for wallet participants. So for instance, SEC-style Edgar disclosures that go into off-chain data that could be important for people making decisions when they're casting votes. You could create identity proxies with reputational indicators, and there already are some DAOs that are doing that. So for instance, DX DAO has rep tokens, and EIP 5114 has the concept of the soul-bound NFT. These are both crypto they're not transferable. You can only earn them by having certain behaviors on the network, and then you can't sell them to anybody, and those would entitle you to votes. So that's an example of building in reputational markers into wallets to help people figure out who's the good actor and who's the nefarious one. You can perhaps, this is a thought experiment, could you create tamper-proof oracles to detect borrowing activity on DeFi platforms prior to a key vote? So oracles that track Etherscan and transactions with those platforms. And that would deal with empty voting. The last might be to incentivize CeFi platforms to provide data on lending activities. Now, I think that that's probably a dim prospect, but maybe the last resort for that would just be to plain old regulate them as they maybe should be. The next item in the toolkit of TradFi would be something called controlling stockholder obligations. And in the context of Web3, it's really a question of whether whales and significant token holders have a responsibility to the rest of the token holders in terms of their behavior and what obligations do they have. So for instance, that doesn't necessarily mean a more than 50% vote. somebody with 10% or 20% or 30% could end up being in control when they aggregate their votes with other allies. So at what point should those trigger? I don't know, but it's an open question whether somebody in that position should have additional obligations to just a regular token holder. For instance, within the TradFi context, those holders would have requirements to provide additional information to token holders if they were making proposals. So for instance, maybe in the Web3 context, standardized templates for improvement proposals when they relate to fundamental issues should request more information regarding the plans or potential conflicts of interest for the proponent and maybe some key financial metrics. You could also implement something called the majority of a minority vote. Basically, that would mean that you don't count the votes of the conflicted controlling member. So you would basically nullify the tokens in their wallet for that vote. Put the burden on the whale or on the proponent to provide information that relates to the fairness of what they're suggesting and what they're proposing. That's another idea. And then a last idea to avoid the steam it situation would be to require that the CeFi platforms either not vote token that they hold for their customers, or if they are going to do it, that first they disclose it, and second, that they vote pro rata alongside the rest of the community vote so that they're not actually changing the outcome with the block of tokens that they hold. Another tool is poison pill. Could we put a poison pill in a smart contract? And how does it work? So these are pretty controversial and powerful deterrents in TradFi. Basically, it would be hard-coded in the governance documents, and you can't remove it by a simple vote. And it creates massive dilution for the exploiter. The last would be maybe a concept of voting cutbacks, and you do see this in financially regulated areas. So for instance, in the Bank Company Holding Act in the US, and under insurance laws and similar financially regulated areas, there are sometimes statutory limits on how many, for instance, being able to vote a maximum of 10% no matter how much you own in a network. And so I'm not saying that that is, that would be appropriate for all instances, but maybe there are some systemically important platforms that should consider those kinds of cutbacks so that you don't have significant holders controlling the outcomes on those platforms if we think that they're a public good or they're important to the ecosystem. So a few observations. I think that we can all tell that these proposals would increase friction and slow down key decisions. Question, is that bad? Maybe not. Certainly having that type of friction might enable more diverse sources of capital to come on platforms. And sometimes the outcomes from these votes are not apparent until long after the tokens have been cashed out on Tornado Cash or have been long gone. So friction maybe isn't the worst thing. You can tell that some of these proposals would require wallet monitoring and some sort of Web3 proxy for identity. And I do think that some of those projects are being worked on, and hopefully they'll come to market soon. Question whether any of this could be built self-executing on chain. I think one thing that's becoming clear, if you can see where the winds are blowing, is that external forces are going to bring this type of regulation and this type of requirement at some point. And so it might behoove DAO platforms to think about implementing them preemptively in the way that they want to see it happen, as opposed to waiting for it to happen from outside. I think one indicator of this is, I don't know if anyone's seen recently, but in California, there is a class action lawsuit about whether DAO holders are general partners and therefore have liability to all the other token holders, and that would include the developers that built the platform. So, court cases settle out and they lose, and we don't know, but the fact that that kind of theory is being set forth, I think should set off a warning for folks that are designing DAO governance that maybe it's time to look more closely at some of these protective provisions that, yes, they do create more friction, but perhaps in some contexts they could be appropriate. Questions? Okay, thank you for having me.